The scent of her terror was what he noticed first. Sharp, sweet, and entirely too human for the frozen hell of the northern ridge. Elena didn't scream when the heavy iron floor grate was ripped from the timbers with a sickening sudden screech of tearing wood. She didn't beg when a hand larger than her entire face reached into the dark crawl space, wrapping around her jacket collar like iron cuffs, and hauled her bodily up into the blinding firelight of her own living room. She hit the hardwood floor hard, the breath driven from her lungs in a sharp gasp. Before she could recover, a massive crushing weight pinned her down. The thing, towered over her, straddling her hips. He was terrifyingly, impossibly massive, his chest a broad wall of dense muscle and jagged silver-edged scars that gleamed in the firelight. His clothes were shredded tatters, but it was his skin that defied nature. He radiated a blistering, feverish heat, a living furnace that turned the snow melting off his broad shoulders into thick, rising columns of steam. Elena's hand scrambled blindly for the bare mace she had dropped, but a heavy, calloused boot stomped down on her wrist. Not breaking the bone but locking her in place with effortless, brutal precision. "Look at me," a voice growled. It didn't sound human. It was a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and deep into Elena's chest, heavy with the weight of a physical threat. Elena forced her gaze upward, her throat tightening. His face was a striking hypermasculine mask of sharp angles, framed by dark, wild hair. But it was his eyes that froze the blood in her veins. They weren't brown or blue, they were a piercing, iridescent gold, burning with a predatory animal intelligence. He leaned down, his massive chest pressing against hers, trapping her beneath his unnatural heat. Elena gasped as his face buried into the crook of her neck. He inhaled sharply, his hot, ragged breath scorching her bare skin as he aggressively mapped her scent. Then his jaw opened. Elena felt the stark, terrifying pressure of elongated, razor-sharp fangs resting directly against her pulsing jugular. He bit down just a fraction, not breaking her skin, but exerting enough dominant force to make her body instantly lock up in absolute submission. Her pulse hammered frantically against his teeth. "You are going to help me survive the night, human," the alpha whispered against her throat, his voice a dark, intoxicating promise of violence and desire. "You will bind my wounds. You will keep the hearth burning. And if you try to run, you won't make it to the tree line before I break you. You have until the sun hits the ridge to decide if you are my savior, or my mate. Welcome to Naomi's Feral Adventures. Before we get on with the story, please head down to the comments and let us know where you are listening from. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss a beat." Elena adjusted the strap of her heavy field pack, her gloved fingers already stiffening despite the thermal layers. As a wildlife researcher assigned to this remote sector of the northern wilderness, she was used to isolation. She preferred it. Animals followed laws. The harsh, beautiful, predictable laws of biology and survival. Humans were complicated. But the data she had pulled from her trail cameras 20 minutes ago didn't fit into any textbook she had ever read. 3 separate camera rigs, bolted to ancient pine trunks 4 miles up the ridge, had been completely obliterated. It wasn't the work of a rogue grizzly or a territorial moose. The high-resolution lenses hadn't been scratched. The entire steel-reinforced housing units had been crushed flat, as if squeezed by a fist of unimaginable size. And the final corrupted frame captured by camera 4 before it went dark? A massive, upright silhouette, broad-shouldered and towering, moving through the whiteout with an unnerving, fluid speed. "Just a trick of the lens deflection," Elena muttered to herself, her voice swallowed instantly by the gale. She used her clinical logical mind like a shield against the creeping paranoia. A lens distortion caused by freezing moisture. Nothing more. But her logic began to fracture the moment her cabin came into view through the swirling white. The structure was a sturdy, double-walled log cabin, built to withstand alpine blizzards. But as Elena crested the final drift, her flashlight beam illuminated a gaping dark void where the front door should have been. The heavy 4-inch timber door hadn't just been kicked open. It had been violently torn off its hinges, the iron castings snapped like brittle twigs, and thrown into the snowbank 5 feet away. Elena stopped dead, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The adrenaline surge was a sudden, violent heat in her chest. She dropped her gaze to the threshold. The security system, a hardwired military-grade alarm she'd installed himself to keep out curious black bears, was a shredded mess of copper wiring and cracked plastic, dangling uselessly from the shattered frame. Slowly, carefully she stepped inside the dark cabin, killing her flashlight to avoid drawing attention. The indoor air was freezing, the blizzard whistling through the open doorway, but the layout was too familiar for her to lose her footing. She slipped her hand into her coat pocket, gripping the small canister of high-grade bear mace. It felt laughably inadequate. As her eyes adjusted to the dim blue gloom of the storm-lit room, her gaze locked onto the kitchen island. Dark, thick droplets were smeared across the clean stainless steel counter. Elena stepped closer, her clinical training overriding her panic for a brief second. She reached out with a gloved finger, touching the substance, and brought it to her nose. Blood. But it was wrong. It wasn't the dark, coagulated blood of the field-dressed deer she had hanging safely out in the locked shed. It was bright, steaming despite the freezing air, and thick with a strange, musk-heavy scent that smelled faintly of ozone and crushed pine needles. It was fresh. Unbelievably fresh. Then she looked down at the floorboards. Deep, wide boot prints, or what looked like the impression of bare feet wrapped in rags, were melting into the wood. The stride length was impossible. The distance between each print was nearly double her own. And they led directly away from the kitchen, down the short, narrow hallway, straight to her bedroom door. The realization hit her like an avalanche. Whatever did this is still inside. And I am entirely trapped. The front door was a gaping hole, but running back out into a Category 5 blizzard meant a slow, freezing death within the hour. She had no vehicle. The snowmobile was parked in the lean-to on the far side of the cabin, and she'd never make it before whatever was in her bedroom heard her. She had exactly one option left. Right beneath her feet, hidden under the heavy woven wool rug in the center of the living room, was the access hatch to the cabin's low crawl space. It was where the main water shut-off valves and the backup generator battery banks were housed. It was cramped, dark, and freezing, but it was the only space in the cabin that didn't offer a direct line of sight. Moving with the agonizing slowness of a predator trying to avoid detection, Elena dropped to her knees. She rolled back the edge of the heavy rug, her ears straining over the roar of the wind outside. Every creak of the cabin's timbers sounded like a gunshot. Her fingers found the recessed iron ring of the hatch. She lifted it centimeter by centimeter, praying the rusted hinges wouldn't betray her. The dark, musty void beneath smelled of damp earth and cold stone. She lowered herself down, her boots finding the top rung of the short wooden ladder. With her left hand she carefully lowered the hatch cover back over her head, pulling the edge of the wool rug back into place as the lid clicked shut. Darkness swallowed her completely. Elena stood on the dirt floor of the crawlspace, her back pressed against a frozen foundation beam. She was trembling, a cocktail of sub-zero chill and raw terror vibrating through her limbs. She forced herself to take shallow, silent breaths through her nose, counting the seconds to keep her mind from spiraling. Then above her a sound cut through the howling storm. It was a heavy rhythmic thud. The floorboards directly above her head groaned under a massive, unyielding weight. The entity had stepped out of her bedroom. Elena kept her eyes wide, staring upward into the pitch black until her vision adjusted. A faint amber glow began to bleed through the shadows from the living room floor grate. A heavy, ornamental iron lattice set into the floorboards to allow heat to circulate from the basement levels. The footsteps grew louder, moving deliberately back toward the kitchen, then stopping right over the living room. Through the narrow slits of the iron grate, Elena could see the faint, shifting outline of two massive legs. The sheer scale of the intruder made her breath catch in her throat. She gripped the bear mace tighter, her knuckles turning white, as she realized just how thin the barrier was between her and the monster that had broken into her sanctuary. From the pitch-black dampness of the crawlspace, Elena froze, her face tilted upward toward the iron lattice of the floor grate. The shadow hovering over her was immense. Through the narrow slits of metal, She could see the silhouette of a man who looked less like a human and more like a force of nature carved from stone and muscle. He stumbled, a low, guttural grunt escaping his throat. A sound so deeply resonant it felt like a physical vibration passing through the floorboards and rattling Elena's teeth. He collapsed heavily onto the hearth rug directly above her. The wood groaned under his massive weight, and immediately an aggressive, unnatural warmth began to bleed downward through the grate. The sub-zero chill that had been creeping into Elena's fingers was instantly cut by a wave of thick, heavy heat. It smelled of ozone, copper, and a raw, musky scent that felt overwhelmingly primal. Elena held her breath, her eyes adapting to the amber firelight filtering down from the living room. The man was stripping off a heavy, tattered coat, throwing it aside to reveal a bare torso that looked completely hypermasculine, covered in a map of rugged, silver-edged scars. His chest was incredibly broad, the muscles thick and dense, heaving with ragged, labored breaths. But it was his leg that made Elena's clinical mind click into sharp focus. Clamped around his right thigh was a jagged, heavy steel hunter's trap, the kind used illegally on the ridge for apex predators. The teeth of the silver trap were buried deep into his flesh, and bright, steaming blood was pooling on the floorboards, dripping through the cracks of the wood. Yet what terrified and fascinated Elena the most wasn't the wound. It was his skin. He was radiating a terrifying, supernatural fever. The snow melting from his heavy boots wasn't just dripping. It was actively sizzling against his skin, turning into white plumes of steam that rose up around his broad shoulders like smoke. His body temperature had to be well over 105 degrees, a fatal threshold for any normal human man. But he wasn't dying. He was furious. Elena watched, completely paralyzed by a toxic mix of voyeuristic fascination and pure dread, as the giant reached down. His massive, scarred hands gripped the solid steel jaws of the hunter's trap. With a low, ferocious growl that sounded like a tectonic plate shifting, he flexed. The dense muscles in his back and arms rippled, veins bulging like thick ropes under his skin, and he violently wrenched the heavy steel trap apart with his bare hands. The metal snapped and deformed under his raw strength. He threw the ruined trap across the room, where it shattered against the stone fireplace. Elena let out the tiniest, involuntary gasp. It was a sound no louder than the click of a mouse, completely swallowed by the howling wind outside. Or so she thought. Above her, the heaving of his massive chest stopped instantly. The cabin went dead silent, save for the roar of the blizzard. The alpha slowly tilted his head down. He didn't look with his eyes. He lifted his chin, his nostrils flaring as he aggressively inhaled the air. He was catching her scent. Through the iron grate, Elena met a pair of piercing, iridescent golden eyes looking straight down into the dark. He knew exactly where she was. Before she could even process the urge to scream, a massive hand slammed onto the iron floor grate. With a terrifying screech of tearing wood, he ripped the heavy ornamental grate entirely out of the floorboards, tossing it aside like wet cardboard. A blast of blinding firelight and scorching, feverish heat hit Elena in the face. Out, the voice rumbled, a dark command that brooked absolutely no refusal. Elena scrambled backward into the dirt, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs, but she wasn't fast enough. A hand larger than her entire face reached down into the dark void of the crawlspace. His fingers, thick and calloused, wrapped like iron cuffs around the collar of her heavy research jacket. With a single effortless jerk of his massive arm, he hauled her bodily up out of the crawlspace, dragging her across the jagged edge of the broken floorboards and throwing her onto the hardwood floor of the living room. Elena hit the ground hard, the breath driven from her lungs in a sharp, pained gasp. The room spun, the blinding light of the hearth fire dancing in her vision. She immediately tried to roll over, her hand scrambling blindly across the floor for the canister of bear mace she had dropped during the scramble. Her fingers brushed the cold plastic. Thud. A heavy, calloused boot stomped down directly on her wrist. He didn't apply enough pressure to break the bone, but the absolute crushing precision of his weight locked her hand instantly to the floorboards. She couldn't move an inch. Elena looked up, her throat tightening with a sudden, suffocating panic. The giant was straddling her hips now, towering over her like a monolith of muscle and scars. Up close, his hypermasculine presence was intoxicatingly overwhelming. The heat radiating off his bare torso was a physical force, washing over her face and neck, making her break into a sudden sweat despite the freezing storm outside. "Look at me," he growled. Elena forced her gaze upward, her clinical defense mechanism completely shattering. His face was a striking mask of sharp angles, heavy brow ridges, and a harsh, beautiful jawline framed by wild, dark hair. But his eyes, those burning golden spheres of predatory intelligence, locked onto hers, stripping away every ounce of her logic until only raw, primal survival remained. He leaned down, his massive chest pressing against hers, trapping her beneath his unnatural heat. Elena gasped as his face buried into the crook of her neck. He inhaled sharply, his hot, ragged breath scorching her bare skin as he aggressively mapped her scent. Then his jaw opened. Elena felt the stark, terrifying pressure of elongated, razor-sharp fangs resting directly against her pulsing jugular. He bit down just a fraction, not breaking her skin, but exerting enough dominant force to make her body instantly lock up in absolute submission. Her pulse hammered frantically against his teeth. "You are going to help me survive the night, human," the alpha whispered against her throat, his voice a dark, intoxicating promise of violence and desire. "You will bind my wounds. You will keep the hearth burning. And if you try to run, you won't make it to the tree line before I break you. You have until the sun hits the ridge to decide if you are my savior or my mate." Chapter 3: The Price of Survival. The pressure of his fangs against her pulsing jugular was an absolute, terrifying reality. Elena could feel the razor-sharp tips vibrating slightly with the low, possessive growl humming deep in the alpha's chest. Her body was locked in a state of primitive paralysis, every instinct screaming at her that a single wrong movement, even a sharp intake of breath, would cause those teeth to tear through her throat. But beneath the sheer panic, her clinical mind, the stubborn, analytical part of her that had survived years tracking deadly apex predators in the wild, began to slowly reassert itself. She forced herself to meet his burning, iridescent golden eyes. She didn't whimper. She didn't beg for her life like the prey he clearly expected her to be. Instead, her jaw tightened and she stared back at him with a fierce, unbroken defiance that made the alpha's eyes flare with sudden, intense curiosity. "Get off me," she managed to squeeze the words out, her voice raw but steady, refusing to let it shake. The alpha let out a low, rumbling sound that was half amused, half threat. Slow as molasses, he lifted his jaw from her neck, though he didn't pull away completely. His hot breath brushed against her damp, heated skin as he tilted his head, studying her face with an unnerving intensity. The absolute weight of his hypermasculine body was crushing, yet the heat radiating from him was a hypnotic, intoxicating contrast to the freezing wind still howling through the cabin's broken doorway. "Defiant," he murmured, his voice a gravelly baritone that seemed to hum right through Elena's bones. "Most humans would be weeping by now." "I'm not most humans," Elena snapped, her adrenaline spiking as he finally shifted his massive weight, lifting his boot off her pinned wrist. "And if you want me to save your life, you're going to have to let me stand up." The alpha rose to his feet in a single, terrifyingly fluid motion. Even wounded, his presence completely dominated the small living room. He stood over 6.5 feet tall, a monolith of dense muscle, jagged scars, and a wild, primal energy that made the air in the cabin feel thick and hard to breathe. He looked down at her, his golden eyes tracking her every move as Elena slowly pushed herself up from the floorboards, rubbing her bruised wrist. She looked at his right thigh. The wound from the silver hunter's trap was horrific. The jagged steel teeth had torn deep into the thick muscle and bright, steaming blood was still pulsing out, staining his torn trousers and pooling on the hardwood. The scent of copper was overwhelming, laced with that strange magnetic musk that belonged entirely to him. "I am Kaelen," he said, the introduction sounding more like a warning. "Alpha of the Ridge Pack. The silver on that trap was forged to stop my kind. It burns from the inside out. If the poison isn't neutralized and the flesh bound before the blizzard peaks, I will bleed out on your floor. Then it's a good thing you broke into a research cabin. Elena said, her practical nature taking over as she forced herself to move past the intoxicating terror of his closeness. She walked toward the hallway, her spine straight, though she could feel his golden gaze boring into her back like a physical touch. Stay by the fire. Try not to bleed on the rug. If you try to slip out the back window, human, I will smell the snow on your skin before you hit the tree line, Kaelen warned, though there was a dark, appreciative tilt to his harsh jawline. My name is Elena, she threw over her shoulder, not looking back. And I'm not stupid enough to run into a Category 5 blizzard. She returned from her laboratory alcove a moment later, carrying a heavy-duty medical kit and a bottle of high-grade surgical antiseptic. When she stepped back into the living room, her breath caught. Kaelen had fully stripped down to the absolute bare essentials to tend to his wounds, sitting on a low wooden bench by the roaring hearth. In the amber glow of the fire, his body was staggering. His shoulders were impossibly broad, his chest a solid wall of sculpted heavy muscle that tapered down to a lean, scarred waist. The heat radiating off his bare skin was so intense it was creating a localized shimmer in the cold air of the room. Every inch of him screamed hypermasculine dominance, a raw, beautiful and terrifying manifestation of an apex predator in human form. Elena swallowed hard, her pulse doing a strange, irregular dance in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. She knelt in the dirt and blood beside his leg, opening the medical kit. This is going to burn, she warned, unscrewing the bottle of chemical antiseptic. Worse than the silver. Kaelen grunted, his massive hands gripping the edges of the wooden bench, the thick veins in his forearms bulging like ropes. Do it. Elena poured the liquid directly into the deep, jagged tear. The chemical hissed as it met the supernatural heat of his blood. Kaelen's entire body went rigid as iron. A low, agonizing roar tore from his throat, a sound so primal it rattled the glassware in the kitchen cabinets. His chest heaved, his head throwing back as his jaw clenched so hard his fangs threatened to pierce his own lips. Yet he didn't move a millimeter. He didn't lash out at her. Elena watched him, her fingers trembling slightly as she grabbed a sterile needle and heavy-grade suture thread. The sheer proximity to his raw, feverish power was overwhelming. As she leaned in close to begin stitching the torn muscle, her face was inches from his hard thigh. She could feel the blistering heat of his skin, could smell the intoxicating wild scent of him filling her senses until her clinical detachment began to dangerously fray. Kaelen lowered his head, his heavy, ragged breathing hot against the crown of her head. You have steady hands, Elena, he whispered, the gravel in his voice laced with a sudden dark intensity. Even while your heart batters against your ribs like a trapped bird. I'm concentrating, she muttered, forcing her focus onto the stitches, though her skin prickled with a sudden electric tension. You smell of mountain air, clean sweat and defiance, Kaelen rumbled, his golden eyes darkening as he leaned down just a fraction closer, his gaze locked on the pulse point of her exposed neck. A dangerous scent to bring into a wolf's territory. Elena pulled the final suture tight, tying the knot with sharp precision before cutting the thread. She looked up, her face now dangerously close to his. The air between them was thick, charged with a sudden, suffocating erotic tension that was as terrifying as it was irresistible. The wound is clean and closed, Elena whispered, her chest rising and falling heavily as she met his predatory gaze. You're going to survive the night, Alpha. Kaelen's hand moved, not with the brutal speed he had used before, but with a slow, deliberate heat. His massive, calloused fingers brushed against the side of her face, his thumb tracing the sharp line of her jaw. His skin was blistering hot, a living furnace against her freezing cheeks, making her gasp at the sudden, intense contact. Surviving the night was only the first part of the ultimatum, Elena, Kaelen murmured, his grip tightening just enough to tilt her face up toward his. The storm is only getting worse. And dawn is still a very long way away. Chapter 4, Thawing the Ice. She could hear the blizzard slamming against the cabin like a battering ram, throwing dead weights of ice against the logs. But inside this small radius of amber firelight, the cold didn't exist. There was only the thick, suffocating weight of his hypermasculine presence and the wild, copper-laced musk of his skin. Elena forced herself to take a slow, shallow breath, trying desperately to re-establish her clinical boundaries. As a researcher, she knew how to read data. And looking at the sheer scale of the alpha's body, she began to process the physical impossibility of what she had just witnessed. This man, this apex predator, was built like an armored wall. His skin was dense, his reflexes faster than a striking viper, and his raw physical strength had turned a steel bear trap into scrap metal. How does something like him get caught? She thought, her eyes tracking the jagged silver poison lacerations she had just stitched. Traps didn't just appear on the ridge. They had to be set by someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. Someone who knew who they were looking for. Summoning every ounce of the defiant courage that had kept her alive on the ridge, Elena reached up and firmly wrapped her smaller, pale fingers around his massive wrist. She didn't flinch away from his feverish heat. Instead, she squeezed, forcing his hand back just a few inches so she could look him dead in the eye. An alpha doesn't just stumble into a silver trap by accident, she said, her voice cutting through the crackle of the hearth with a sharp, interrogative edge. Who did this to you, Kaelen? Kaelen's jaw clenched, a low, dangerous rumble vibrating deep in his chest. His golden eyes went rigid, the dark pupils constricting until they were razor-thin slits. The wilderness has teeth, human. I took a careless step. Don't lie to me, Elena snapped, her chin lifting with that characteristic defiance that the alpha seemed to both hate and crave. I'm a wildlife biologist. I've mapped every inch of this ridge. No local poacher has the resources to forge specialized silver artillery. Those silver-edged teeth were machined. They were designed to neutralize a cellular structure that regenerates. Who is hunting you? A dark, prideful fury flashed across Kaelen's harsh features. He tore his wrist from her grip, his massive chest heaving as he turned his face toward the dying embers of the fire. His broad shoulders bunched, the silver-tipped scars on his back tightening like coiled cables. He was fiercely unwilling to admit his vulnerability, unwilling to confess that mere humans had managed to outmaneuver the alpha of the ridge. It is none of your concern, he growled, the gravel in his voice dangerously sharp. It became my concern the second you ripped my front door off its hinges, Elena countered, stepping closer, entirely disregarding the fact that she was poking a wounded monster. You're bleeding silver on my floor. If there are people on my ridge with that kind of specialized weaponry, I need to know. Kaelen remained silent for a long, agonizing beat, his fingers digging into the edge of the wooden bench until the timber groaned under his grip. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, terrifyingly dark whisper that made the hairs on Elena's arms stand up. They are not local poachers, he admitted, the words tasting like venom on his tongue. They are organized. Ruthless. They have been tracking my pack across the northern sectors for 3 months. They don't hunt for meat and they don't hunt for sport. They bring heavy artillery, thermal tracking drones, and weapons laced with forged silver to suppress our nature. He turned his head slowly, his burning golden eyes locking onto hers with a sudden, suffocating intensity. They managed to isolate me from my pack during the whiteout. I destroyed 3 of their units before the trap took my leg. But they are persistent, Elena. And they are close. The realization hit her like a blast of sub-zero wind. He hadn't just broken into her cabin for shelter. He was a soldier retreating from a highly organized war zone. And now she was right in the middle of the blast radius. Yet as she looked at him sitting in the firelight, his massive hypermasculine body scarred from a months-long battle to protect his kind, the primal terror she expected to feel didn't come. Instead, a dark, intoxicating wave of protectiveness and deep attraction washed over her. He was a king fighting for his kingdom, and his raw, unbreakable spirit was the most beautiful, terrifying thing she had ever witnessed. Kaelen noticed the shift in her scent instantly. The sharp tang of fear was completely gone, replaced by a deep, heated warmth that made his nostrils flare. He rose from the bench, his massive frame towering over her as he took a slow, heavy step forward. The feverish heat radiating off his bare chest was a physical wave, melting the last of Elena's logical defenses. You aren't afraid, Kaelen rumbled, his voice dropping into a dark, seductive register that vibrated straight through her core. Why aren't you running, Elena? Because you're too injured to chase me, she whispered defiantly, though her breath caught as his shadow completely swallowed her. I don't need to chase you, Kaelen murmured, his hand coming out to cup the back of her neck, his thick fingers tangling in her hair. He pulled her gently but unyieldingly against his massive, sculpted chest. The contrast was staggering, her soft, breathing body pressed against his solid, burning wall of muscle. Your pulse is racing. Your scent is shifting. The beast inside me knows exactly what you want, human. Elena looked up, her lips parting as she met his predatory gaze. The erotic tension in the room was a living, breathing thing, snapping between them like static before a lightning strike. Kaelen leaned down, his hot, ragged breath scorching her lips as he whispered against her skin. The storm is peaking, Elena. And the hunters will have to wait. Because right now there is only the fire, and the mate I am going to claim before the dawn. Chapter 5. The Approaching Roar. Elena had faded out right there on the woven wool rug, completely cocooned against Kaelen's massive furnace-hot chest. For a few brief hours, her face had been buried in the crook of his neck, her senses entirely drowned by his wild, addictive scent of ozone and crushed pine needles. She had felt safer cradled in the arms of an apex predator than she ever had in civilization. But the northern ridge never let anyone rest for long. Elena was violently jolted awake not by a sound, but by a low rhythmic tremor that vibrated through the floorboards, rattling her teeth. It was a deep, mechanical thudding, the heavy, unmistakable rumble of large diesel engines fighting their way up the ridge's iced switchbacks. She sat up fast, the sub-zero air of the cabin hitting her bare, heated neck like a slap. Kaelen was already on his feet. He stood like a dark, terrifying monolith between her and the shattered doorway, the fading amber glow of the firelight painting the jagged silver-edged scars across his broad shoulders in sharp relief. The raw, defensive posture of his hypermasculine body was staggering. His chest, thick and heavily built, heaved with a low, bloodthirsty resonance. His nostrils flared as he aggressively mapped the incoming wind, his long razor-sharp fangs fully extended over his lower lip, glinting lethal in the shadows. Seeing him like this, a fierce supernatural protector standing prepared to tear the world apart to keep her safe, sent a violent jolt of pure, intoxicating heat straight to Elena's core. It turned her on with an intensity that terrified her. Her heart battered against her ribs, a liquid flush spreading down her spine as she watched the dense muscles in his thighs and back bunch like coiled steel cables. He was a god of the wild preparing for a massacre. But right behind the desire came a cold, suffocating wave of panic. Kaelen, she whispered, her voice tight as she scrambled to her feet, her boots slipping slightly on the frost-dusted floorboards. They're here. Your leg. Those surgical stitches won't hold if you drop into a full change. You'll rip your own muscle to shreds. Let them come, Kaelen rumbled, not even looking back at her. His voice was a gravelly baritone that vibrated through the very foundation of the cabin. A dark, predatory rage simmered in his golden eyes, the irises burning like molten gold in the gloom. I will tear the throats from their bodies before they can even unload their artillery. This ends on your porch, Elena. Are you insane? Elena hissed. She stepped directly into his personal space, entirely disregarding the fact that she was poking a wounded monster. She slapped her palm flat against his bare chest, feeling the thunderous, erratic pound of his heart against her hand. You've been tracking a silver-induced fever all night. They have tactical gear, thermal tracking, and silver-laced artillery. If you just run out there blindly to fight them head-on, you're committing suicide. Kaelen growled, a terrifyingly deep sound that vibrated right into her palm. His massive, calloused hand came up, gripping her shoulder. He didn't crush her, but the absolute dominant force of his weight locked her in place, forcing her to look up into his harsh, striking jawline. I do not run, human. A wolf defends his ground. I will dismantle their vehicles with my bare hands before I let them touch you. We compromise, you stubborn, prideful beast. Elena snapped back, her characteristic defiance flaring hotter. You want to fight and I want you to survive. We use the terrain. They are tracking your heat signature, which means they are expecting you to stay pinned in this cabin. The ridge has a narrow blind choke point right before my clearing. If we bait them into thinking you're fleeing down the eastern ravine, we can split their focus. She leaned in closer, the intoxicating warm scent of him filling her lungs, making her dizzy despite the high stakes. You take the high ground on the rocky ledge. I'll lead them into the deep snow drifts by the shed where their heavy tactical boots will sink. When they are disoriented, you strike from above. Kaelen studied her face, his golden eyes narrowing as he took in the fierce, unbroken spirit of the woman standing before him. He let out a low, rough breath that scorched her forehead. It is too dangerous, Elena. If they catch a glimpse of you, they will use you to make me submit. They won't see me, she promised, her fingers tightening on his chest before she pulled away. Don't move. The plan was set in a frantic, adrenaline-fueled heartbeat, but the tactical hunters were tighter on their perimeter than they anticipated. As Elena bolted through the rear woodshed door to set the false tracks, a blinding, high-intensity spotlight cut through the swirling whiteout, turning the snow into a wall of piercing, artificial glare. The roar of a diesel engine screamed directly to her left. Elena turned to dive into the thick pine cover, but her boots caught on a buried, ice-slicked log. She hit the drifts hard, the freezing powder filling her mouth and lungs as she rolled over. Before she could push herself up, two heavily armored military-grade boots slammed into the snow right beside her head. A rough, gloved hand seized the collar of her heavy research jacket with brutal force, hauling her up into the blinding beam of a tactical flashlight. "We got a civilian," a harsh voice shouted through a helmet comm, static crackling over the roar of the wind. "Repeat, we have a local researcher in the grid. The target is close. I repeat, the beast is in the immediate area." Elena thrashed violently, her jaw setting in absolute defiance as she glared into the tinted visor of the soldier's helmet, refusing to show them an ounce of fear. "Get your filthy hands off me," she screamed, her voice echoing across the clearing, praying to God Kaelen was already in position on the ledge. But as the soldier dragged her back toward the bright, idling lights of the trucks, she realized with a sickening jolt that she had just become the ultimate bait. Kaelen didn't just drop from the treeline. He descended like a falling star of muscle, scars, and fury. The silver poison coursing through his veins was completely overridden, burned out by the raw, primitive necessity of protection. Elena watched in stunned, breathless awe as Kaelen slammed directly onto the hood of the first tactical diesel truck. The sheer kinetic force of his impact crushed the heavy steel engine block like paper, sending a spray of fire and sparks into the whiteout. A soldier panicked, lifting a specialized rifle to fire a silver-tipped round point-blank into Kaelen's side. The bullet tore into his flesh, but the Alpha didn't even flinch. With a terrifying, guttural snarl, the dense muscles in Kaelen's back and arms bunched to their absolute limit. He drove his bare shoulder deep under the front chassis of the 4-ton truck. With a single earth-shattering lift of his massive hypermasculine arm, he violently flipped the entire truck completely onto its roof, crushing the artillery underneath it in a screech of tearing iron. He was a blur of lethal, breathtakingly beautiful violence. He ripped the heavy doors off the trailing van with his bare claws, dragging the tactical soldiers out into the snow drifts, dismantling their armor with a savage, dominant power that was nothing short of a primal god protecting his sanctuary. The raw masculinity of his display was intoxicating. Elena couldn't take her eyes off him, her body trembling with a chaotic mix of terror and deep, visceral desire as he cleared the threat out of existence. By the time the final engine died, sizzling and smoking in the deep drifts, the clearing was dead silent save for Kaelen's heavy, ragged breathing. But the victory had a brutal cost. The silver rounds had taken their toll. Kaelen stumbled, his massive chest covered in deep, smoking chemical burns from the ammunition. He collapsed heavily into the snow, his golden eyes fluttering shut as his supernatural heat began to rapidly drain into the freezing alpine night. When Kaelen finally opened his eyes, the blinding whiteout was gone, replaced by the quiet blue gloom of dawn breaking over the ridge. He was lying on the hardwood floorboards of the cabin, or what was left of it. The roof had partially caved in from the concussive force of the fight, the walls were scorched, and the entire space was a chaotic pile of timber and snow-dusted debris. But he wasn't cold. A thick, heavy wool blanket was draped over his torso, and a sharp, stinging warmth was being pressed against his bare chest. He groaned, a low, gravelly sound escaping his throat as his jaw clenched. He looked down through bleary vision. Elena was kneeling directly over him, straddling his waist just as he had done to her the night before. Her heavy research jacket was off, leaving her in a form-fitting thermal shirt. Her cheeks were flushed a deep, beautiful pink from the heat of the surviving hearth fire, and her hands were covered in his thick, dark blood as she methodically swabbed his silver burns with a fresh cloth. "You're awake," she whispered, her voice dropping into a soft, intensely relieved register that she couldn't mask. Then a crooked, defiant smile touched her lips, her eyes locking onto his. "Good. Because dragging your heavy, smelly, hypermasculine hide inside through 3 feet of snow drifts almost threw my back out completely." Kaelen didn't laugh. His golden eyes, fully unguarded and heavy with a raw, terrifying depth of emotion, searched her face. He reached up slowly, his large, trembling hand framing the side of her face, his thumb brushing against her lower lip. His skin was starting to heat up again, that slow, intoxicating, supernatural fever returning to his blood. "You should have left me to freeze, Elena," he murmured, his gravelly baritone laced with a deep, aching tenderness that cut straight through her defenses. "Being with me, it will get you killed. The world I live in is a war. I cannot guarantee your safety from what comes next. I am a monster to them." Elena stopped cleaning his wounds. She looked down at his massive, beautifully scarred chest, then leaned forward until her front was pressed flat against his solid wall of muscle, putting her smaller hand directly over his heart. The steady, thunderous beat vibrated right into her palm. "I'm a wildlife researcher, Kaelen," she whispered, her eyes burning with a fierce, absolute certainty as she tilted her head up to meet his gaze. "I don't run from the wild. I study it, and I survive it. I've already mapped your territory, Alpha. I'm not going anywhere." A heavy, breathless silence fell over the ruined cabin. The erotic tension that had been simmering between them all night suddenly snapped, turning the freezing air between them into a localized furnace. Kaelen's grip on the back of her neck tightened, his thick, calloused fingers tangling deep into her hair as he pulled her down until her lips were just millimeters from his. His hot, ragged breath scorched her skin. Elena's heart battered frantically against her ribs, her body breaking into a flush of liquid heat as she looked down at his parted lips, where his sharp fangs were glinting beautifully in the dawning light. She leaned down a fraction closer, her lips brushing against his in a teasing, agonizingly slow torment as she whispered with a wicked, defiant smirk. "Well, since I'm staying, I was just wondering if the great, terrifying Alpha of the Ridge didn't want to claim his mate by dawn anymore? Or did that little truck-flipping routine wear you out, big guy?" Kaelen let out a low, dark, predatory growl that vibrated directly against her mouth, his golden eyes flaring with a primitive hunger that completely stripped away his control. "Never," he whispered against her skin. With a sudden, explosive burst of dominant movement, he rolled her completely beneath him, his massive, heavy body pinning her deep into the blankets on the floor. His blistering skin pressed flat against hers, his jaw opening as his teeth brushed the racing, frantic pulse point of her neck, firmly locking his fangs over her skin just enough to make her submit as he claimed what was his in the shadows of the ruined ridge.